New Testament Bible scholar Ben Witherington, he tells a story about his dad's church. Once a year, the people of the church, they're asked to make these annual pledges. Sort of, this is how much we'll give to the church's ministry this year. Some churches do this in order to help them budget for the year. A man in the church, a well-off lawyer, was responsible for going house to house to collect the pledges. On his route, he came to the home of a retired widow living on a fixed income in a trailer at the edge of town. And the woman let him in, and they visited for a bit. The longer that he stayed, the more uncomfortable the man felt, asking her for a pledge. He noticed her tiny trailer, her small yard. And after a bit, the conversation wrapped up, and the lawyer decided that he wasn't going to ask for a pledge, and he started to hurry to the door. And the widow said, "Wait a minute, son, I've got my pledge on the fridge." And the man awkwardly tried to resist her. That's all right, ma'am. We understand that you're just barely getting by. But before he could finish his sentence, she had gotten right up in his face, grabbed him by his lapels, and said, "Don't you take away from me my opportunity to contribute to the ministry of Jesus. Don't you do it, son." Then she handed him her pledge card. This story reminds me of a small group of Christians living in one of the poorest regions in India almost 100 years ago. Whenever these Christians would cook anything, they'd take a handful of dry rice and they would put it in a separate container to give to their local church. And the church would then take the rice, the dry rice they had. I see Elizabeth nodding in the background. With this, and they would give it to the church. And then the church would take the rice that had been given and they would sell it in the community, and they would use the income to provide for a local minister who might serve as a missionary to neighbors who didn't know Jesus. And at this time, there were very few Christians. The very first year of this practice, our very first records of it, the church made $1.50 for the year. And it all went to this local minister. Well, Indian Christians in this region have continued this practice of giving a handful of rice, teaching it to each new generation. And today, there are some estimates that this practice raises about $1.5 million in the church, through the church, and it allows churches in this region to support thousands of missionaries at home in India and abroad. One Indian church leader describes the practice saying, "When I cook for my family, I cook a meal for the Lord as well. As long as we have something to eat every day, we have something to give God every day." You can hear the Lord's Prayer, can't you? "Lord, give us today our daily rice so we can make sure someone else has their daily rice." Two very different stories, different cultures, different languages, and yet, right, you can hear in both this deep connection between material stuff and God. The widow talked about giving her money to Jesus, and the Indian Christians talked about giving their food to God. Brian Baki tells another story. Number 25. Does that mean anything to you? Any of you from Argentina? This is the name of a prison in Argentina. A prison built for the most violent criminals. Every single inmate in this prison has murdered at least 2 people. How about that for an entrance qualification? The Argentinian government doesn't provide any food or clothing for the inmates at number 25. The only way to survive is through support from families or friends on the outside. And there are inmates who never get a visit from family, and inmates who would starve to death because no one sends them anything. Except prison number 25 is the most unlikely of places to find itself in the middle of spiritual renewal. Number 25 has a thriving church, bringing murderers and some of Argentina's worst criminals to faith in Jesus. Now, number 25 also has a seminary training program, preparing followers of Jesus to serve as pastors and leaders in the prison and even out as some are released. In a prison full of violent men, number 25 church has eliminated violence from the prison. And one of the ways that these followers of Jesus are living out their faith is in their practice of tithing, whatever they receive from the outside. And I put tithing in quotes because a tithe literally means a tenth of something. But these inmates collectively tithe a third of all that they receive from the outside. The church in this prison has a tithe room for food and clothes for those who have nothing, those who would starve and be naked. If this wasn't enough, the chief of the prison reported that with their excess food, these men have been working together to make 2,400 small cakes to send to the children living just down the road from the prison, children living in a destitute neighborhood wrecked by extreme poverty. These violent criminals turned non-violent followers of Jesus are now a collective light shining from a prison. Models of generosity, now giving back to the very community that they once stole from. God's will is being done in number 25 as it is in heaven. I mean, can you hear the Beatitudes at work in these stories? Blessed is the widow who demands to give her money to Jesus. She knows the joy of being a citizen in God's kingdom. But blessed are the Indian Christians who give their food to God. They know what it means to be filled by God. Blessed are the spirit-filled inmates who make peace with their fellow inmates and who show mercy to the children down the road. Like they are indeed children of God, and they are receiving mercy. Each of these stories come from a book called Practicing the King's Economy, honoring Jesus in how we work, earn, spend, save, and give. And the very first chapter calls us to a life fully devoted to God. And it starts by unpacking Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The authors of this book, they make clear, like we are, whether we like it or not, we are people who worship. To be human is to worship. The question is always, who will we worship? Or what will we worship? Whether we believe in God or not, we will give our lives to something, to someone. We will serve something bigger than ourselves. But this book, echoing Jesus, invites us to serve God, not money. Each of these three stories, the widow, the Indian Christians, and the inmates, they show us, they give us a glimpse of what this kind of God worship looks like across cultures and across contexts. Right? We're not called to imitate any of them directly. We're invited into the same deep, trusting relationship with the Father that they have, and that is evidence in their giving. You might notice something about these three stories, right? That all three of them come from the same social and economic status. These are all stories of the poor at the bottom or the edges of society, people who have been forgotten or neglected by the world, people who maybe not seen by the world have felt deeply seen by God. These are people who, in their near complete lack of material stuff, have experienced God's generosity in such intimate and life-saving, life-sustaining ways that they can't help but respond with anything other than the same kind of generosity that they have received from God, not just helping others, not just trying to do good, but often finding themselves being used by God to save, to sustain the lives of their neighbors. It shouldn't surprise us, and it rarely surprises us, I think, when people with so little money often give so sacrificially. But it sometimes does surprise us, maybe often, when we learn that people with more money tend to give a much smaller portion of what they have compared to those who have less. Back in 2017, a Bible scholar, Scott McKnight, he reported some numbers that American Christians, this isn't just Americans, these are those who profess faith in Jesus, who make $10,000 or less a year, give away on average 11.2% of their income, right? So on average, as a group, they're giving more than a 10% tithe away. And even thinking about a tithe, especially as we consider the Sermon on the Mount and this invitation to right relationship, this resistance to following mere rules, but instead to be deeply in relationship. I'm reminded of this quote from Randy Alcorn in his book on money and possessions when he writes, "Tithing isn't the ceiling of giving, it's the floor. It's not the finish line of giving, it's the starting blocks. Tithes can be the training wheels to launch us into the mindset, skills, and habits of grace giving." Contrast this first group with American Christians who make more than $150,000 a year. This is in 2017. They give away, on average, 2.7% of their income. 2.7. And you can just follow the graph from low to high and see this trend play out the entire way. I don't know if this surprises you. I don't know if it rings true to you that having more money doesn't make you more generous automatically. It seems to actually often have the exact opposite effect. Oh, and we also know that having more money doesn't make you happier either. While there is a certain level, like a base amount of income that can truly help eliminate harmful stress in our lives, Basically, any amount of money that you get and make and keep over that has no positive, meaningful effect on your life at all. In fact, it often seems to have the opposite. And then this might be the biggest shock to the system, that having more money doesn't make you more secure. It doesn't guarantee comfort. It certainly cannot keep you from dying. It can provide the illusion of some security, but often our wealth is fragile, far more fragile than we ever want to believe. Because like Jesus says, much of it is easily destroyed. For more than 100 years, American Christian teachers, Bible scholars, theologians, pastors, and lay people have been in various places sounding the alarm. Jesus says you cannot serve both God and money, but there is something about the American way of life that is structured and that is patterned to make us serve our money and not our God. And so you have people writing books over the last decades, Christians in an age of wealth, a biblical theology of stewardship. Ron Sider writes, Rich Christians in an age of hunger. Randy Alcorn writes, Money, Possessions, and Eternity. And there are so many of these resources reflecting on what do we do with this? How do we resist the temptation to worship our stuff? And each of them, they make this case that the worship of money, it might be our chief acceptable sin. I've heard multiple pastors say that in their ministries, they have plenty of people who confess sin to them. Lots of sins, some creative ones. But greed, never. Hoarding stuff, nope. Consuming more than I need, consumption is our way of life. It is our habit. It is our pattern. It is the water we swim in. We live in a place that just 10 years ago was determined by some magazine, to be the third wealthiest mid-sized city in the nation. It would seem that our wealth ought to raise some red flags. But our lives have been perfectly designed to serve our things. A couple years ago, number of years, more than 10 years ago now. Wow, time flies as you get older. There's a couple I knew who had finally graduated all of their kids from college. And they were finally and forever empty nesters. I say forever, right? Because you know how this goes. Sometimes you're an empty nester and then you're not. But in their empty nest, they announced they were moving to a new house across town. I naively assumed they were downsizing into a smaller place. But they bought a significantly larger home and didn't sell the old one. And I wasn't nearly as good back then at hiding my surprise. And so the wife, she saw my reaction, and she quickly told me, I know it seems weird, but we really need room to store all of our stuff. And that was a direct quote. This is a family who gives plenty of money. They give money to their church, to people in need, to other organizations. But here, with tremendous resources, with so much extra that could have been used to serve God, was literally put to use to serve their stuff, to house their stuff. Jonathan Pennington wrote a commentary, an excellent commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, and he breaks this morning's passage up into 2 parts. The first part, where we've kind of been living right now, is our relationship with our stuff. And the second part is our relationship with other people. And we spent most of our time looking at our relationship with our stuff. And this is because I think if we don't get this right, our relationships with others will forever be a mess. Here's what I mean by that. This entire section on stuff and our relationship with it isn't really and ultimately about stuff. It's about God. And it's about trust in God. This whole section, it's asking questions like, do we trust ourselves and our stuff to keep us safe, to keep us fed, to keep us clothed? Or do we trust God? Not just some impersonal divine being out there, not just some higher power. Do we trust our Father who made us? Our Father who, Jesus reminds us, he feeds the birds of the sky. Our Father who clothes the grass of the field. Our Father who knows what we need before we ask him. Our Father who is good and who is right, who does right by those that he is in relationship with. Our Father in heaven who is a better Father than every earthly father. Do we trust him to give better gifts, to take better care of us than our well-meaning, doing their best, and severely limited earthly fathers? Jesus tells us our relationships have to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. This passage unpacks that for us. The scribes and the Pharisees were living comfortable lives at a time when very few were. They were well off in their society, and they trusted their stuff to keep them secure. Jesus invites his followers into a deeper relationship with the Father, one of this deep and abiding trust. Trust is at the very center of relationship. This trust that God is good, that God is reliable, that God is faithful to his promises, that God is trustworthy. What better way to learn to trust God than with our daily bread and our regular provision? But there's this question. It's kind of a chicken and an egg question, sort of. Like, what comes first? The trusting with our hearts or the giving with our hands? Do we trust with our hearts first and then we give, or do we give with our hands first and then we start to trust? In Practicing the King's Economy, the authors make a pretty compelling biblical argument. And I have kind of a long quote here, and I can forward it to you if you want it this week. I think it'll be up here. But when most of us hear this familiar passage, we actually hear Jesus saying, "Where your heart is, there your treasure will be also." We hear Jesus making the true point that what we do with our money and resources indicates where our hearts are. We hear Jesus like a weatherman offering us a barometer that will measure our affections. Right? So we look at what we're giving and we can say, oh, this is how. That's not actually what Jesus is saying. In this passage, Jesus doesn't give us a thermometer or barometer to measure the temperature of our hearts, but a thermostat to change the temperature of our hearts. He stands before us like a doctor, offering us a prescription that can help heal our idolatry. According to Jesus, when we invest in the kingdom, our hearts follow our investments. So, will we trust our Father? That when we imitate the generosity he's shown us, our hearts will be transformed. If trust is the core issue in our relationship with God, judgment is the core issue that breaks our relationships with other people. And I want to tell you something I found interesting over the last month. Since we started our time in the Sermon on the Mount, I keep asking this question. I've asked it in our neighborhood group, I've asked the board, in various places I've asked it. What do you believe God wants you to do to live out the Sermon on the Mount? It's been a fun question. And the answers are not all identical, but I have been shocked at how many times I have received this same answer. I want to be less judgmental. Just, this is the one that keeps coming up. I want to be less judgmental. I know that I can be judgy. Fantastic. That's amazing sort of awareness and a desire to grow. I have yet to hear anyone give me any sort of strategy for how they might put that into practice. But I actually wonder in a deep way if the core to our judgmental attitudes is actually that once again, we don't trust our merciful Father to be the judge. Not only for others, but for ourselves as well. We often feel the need to judge because I'm not convinced God's gonna do it right. Or that if I don't speak up, that God will take care of that person on his own. We are too convinced that our judgments are the right judgments, and we assume that God probably agrees with all of my judgments, just as we assume that God is not too bothered about the ways we serve our money. Just as I need to be less judgmental has been the nearly universal response to my question, I have heard 0 people make a commitment to changing their use of their money or their stuff, or to say, this is an area that I want God to challenge me in. And so I wonder if we have this backwards. I just wonder if we do. Like, what if food and drink and clothing, like the basics of everyday life, what if these are the prime training ground for learning to trust that God is good and reliable and trustworthy? Just as we learned to trust our parents or not trust them in those early years when they were feeding us and clothing us or not. And what if giving away our stuff and our money is actually how we learn to trust God? And as a reminder, we don't have to imitate the exact giving of the widow or the Indian Christians or the inmates of number 25, but I wonder if Jesus this morning is inviting us, all of us, into a deeper trust of our Father. Where is Jesus inviting you to rest in the Father's love and to trust more deeply in his ability to care for you? As you consider the answer to that question, I'm going to invite Pastor David and the team forward. And we're going to come to the table together